In 480 BC, 300 Spartan warriors stood against the greatest army the world had ever seen. Their king, Leonidas, looked across the narrow pass at Thermopylae and saw death approaching. But he also saw something else, the birth of Western civilization hanging in the balance. But here's what will shock you. Leonidas wasn't supposed to be there. He was breaking Spartan law by marching to war during a religious festival. Why would the most disciplined society in history risk everything on one man's decision to defy tradition? This is the story of how a collection of squabbling city-states became the foundation of everything we know about democracy, philosophy, art, and human achievement. But it almost never happened, and the reason it did will change how you see courage forever. Our story begins in darkness. Around 1200 BC, something catastrophic happened. The great Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean collapsed almost overnight. The Mycenaeans, who had built massive palaces and conquered Troy itself, simply vanished. But here's the mystery that archaeologists are still trying to solve. They left behind no explanation. No invasion records, no natural disaster evidence, no economic collapse indicators. It's as if an entire civilization just decided to disappear. What could be so terrifying that it erased the most advanced society of its time? Their linear B script was forgotten. Their cities were abandoned. For 3 centuries, Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages. But in this darkness, something extraordinary was brewing. Small communities scattered across the Greek peninsula began telling stories of heroes who had lived before the darkness fell, stories of Achilles and Hector, of Odysseus and his 10-year journey home. These weren't just entertainment, they were the DNA of Greek civilization. Around 750 BC, a blind poet named Homer, if he even existed, did something revolutionary. He took these oral traditions and wove them into 2 epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But here's what will blow your mind. Homer was creating the world's first psychological thriller. The Iliad isn't just about war, it's about rage, honor, and what happens when pride destroys everything you love. Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, spends most of the epic sulking in his tent because his feelings were hurt. Think about that. The fate of Troy hung on one man's emotional breakdown. These weren't just stories. They were instruction manuals for how to be Greek. Every aristocrat memorized them. Every child learned them. They became the DNA of Greek civilization, and they're still shaping how we tell stories today. But Homer was just the beginning. By 700 BC, something unprecedented was happening across the Greek world. Small settlements were growing into something entirely new, the polis, or city-state. Each was independent, fiercely proud, and absolutely convinced they were superior to everyone else. Picture this, you're a citizen of Athens in 650 BC. Your city is just one of hundreds scattered from Spain to the Black Sea, but you don't think of yourself as Greek first. You're Athenian. Your rivals in Sparta, barbarians. The Corinthians, merchants with no honor. The Thebans, don't even get started. But here's the paradox that would define Greek history. These city-states were constantly at war with each other, yet they shared something deeper: language, gods, culture, and above all, a revolutionary idea that would change the world forever. In 594 BC, Athens was on the brink of civil war. The rich were getting richer, the poor were being sold into slavery to pay their debts, and revolution was brewing. Sound familiar? The city needed someone everyone trusted, a man named Solon. But here's what makes Solon extraordinary. He was rich enough to be part of the problem, yet he chose to be part of the solution. When given absolute power to fix Athens, he did something that would have been unthinkable to any other aristocrat in history. Solon canceled all debts overnight, not reduced them, canceled them completely. He freed every Athenian who had been enslaved for debt. Then, in the most shocking move of all, he gave up his power voluntarily and left Athens for 10 years so no one could pressure him to change his laws. This wasn't just reform. This was a man sacrificing his own class interests to save his city. Solon proved that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is put the common good above personal gain. Then came Cleisthenes in 508 BC, and this is where it gets really interesting. He divided Athens into 10 tribes, mixed rich and poor together, and created the world's first democracy, but not the kind you know today. This was raw, direct democracy where every male citizen over 18 could speak and vote in the assembly. Imagine it. A potter could stand up and argue with a general. A farmer could propose laws that affected the entire city. For the first time in human history, ordinary people had real political power. The aristocrats were horrified. One of them, Critias, later complained that democracy was the foolish many ruling over the wise few. But here's what made it work: ostracism. Once a year, Athenians could vote to exile anyone who was becoming too powerful. No trial, no crime needed. Just you're getting too big for your boots. Goodbye for 10 years. It was democracy with a safety valve. While Athens was experimenting with democracy, something massive was stirring in the east. The Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, stretched from India to Egypt. Its king, Darius I, controlled more territory and wealth than any ruler in history. But here's what's terrifying. Darius wasn't just powerful, he was patient. While Greek cities squabbled over trade routes and territory, he was building the most sophisticated intelligence network in the ancient world. Persian spies were everywhere, mapping Greek defenses, recruiting local allies, learning Greek military tactics. In 500 BC, the Greek cities of Ionia, modern-day Turkey, rebelled against Persian rule. They asked their cousins across the Aegean for help. Most Greek cities said no. Why provoke the sleeping giant? But Athens made a decision that would change history forever. They sent ships, just 20 vessels, but enough to burn Sardis, the Persian regional capital. It seemed like a minor raid. It was actually a declaration of war against the most powerful empire on Earth. Darius was furious, but his response revealed the calculating mind that had built an empire. According to Herodotus, he ordered a servant to remind him 3 times daily, "Master, remember the Athenians." This wasn't just about punishing a rebellious city. This was about teaching the entire Greek world who ruled the known world. And here's what the Athenians didn't realize. They had just signed their own death warrant. In 492 BC, Darius sent his first expedition. It was destroyed by storms off Mount Athos. The gods, it seemed, were protecting Greece, but Darius wasn't finished. 2 years later, the storm broke. A Persian fleet carrying 25,000 men landed at Marathon, just 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians sent a runner, yes, the original Marathon runner, to Sparta, begging for help. The Spartans said they'd come after their religious festival ended. So 11,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans faced the mighty Persian army alone. Their general, Miltiades, made a decision that seemed like madness: attack uphill against a superior force. But he had noticed something. The Persian center was weak, their best troops on the flanks. The Greeks charged, the Persian flanks held, but their center collapsed. Suddenly, the mighty Persian army was running for their ships. Against all odds, the Greeks had won. Democracy had defeated despotism. The runner who brought news of victory to Athens collapsed and died after delivering his message. Nike, victory! But this was just round 1. Far away in Persepolis, a new king was planning something that would make Marathon look like a minor skirmish. Xerxes, the God King. Where Darius had been calculating, Xerxes was passionate. Where Darius had been patient, Xerxes was impulsive. And where Darius had failed, Xerxes was determined to succeed on a scale that would make the gods themselves tremble. But here's what made Xerxes truly dangerous. He was utterly convinced of his own divinity. In his mind, he wasn't just a king attacking Greece. He was a god teaching mortals their place in the cosmic order. For 4 years, he prepared the largest military force ever assembled. According to Herodotus, it numbered 2.6 million men. Modern historians think closer to 200,000, but even that was unprecedented. This wasn't just an invasion, it was the migration of nations. In 480 BC, Xerxes did something his father never attempted. He bridged the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe. 2 parallel bridges nearly a mile long, held up by 674 ships. But here's the moment that reveals Xerxes' terrifying psychology. When storms destroyed the first attempt, he ordered the sea itself to be whipped 300 times for disobedience. Then he had the engineers who built the bridge beheaded. This wasn't madness. This was the mindset of a god king who believed the elements themselves should obey him. When the Persian host finally moved, it took 7 days and 7 nights to cross. Xerxes sat on a throne of white marble, watching his subjects march past. And then something extraordinary happened. He wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of his own power. He was watching the most magnificent sight in human history, and he had created it. But those tears revealed something else. Somewhere deep inside, Xerxes knew this was his masterpiece, and masterpieces are finished things. After this, what worlds were left to conquer? In Greece, panic. The oracle at Delphi gave Athens a cryptic prophecy. Pray to the winds, for they will be your allies. Most Greeks heard surrender, but one man heard something different. Themistocles, brilliant, ambitious, absolutely convinced he was the smartest person in any room he entered. But here's what made him extraordinary. He was right. While other politicians played it safe, Themistocles had been preparing for this moment for years, building the Athenian navy despite fierce opposition. Picture Themistocles at 35, pacing the docks of Piraeus, calculating, planning, seeing 10 moves ahead while his rivals were still figuring out the current game. He had grown up poor, clawed his way to power through pure intelligence, and now he was about to make the most audacious proposal in Greek history. Abandon Athens. Let the Persians burn the city. The real battle would be fought at sea. Most Athenians thought he was insane. Abandon their temples, their homes, their ancestors' tombs. But Themistocles had interpreted the oracle correctly. The wooden walls that would save Athens weren't the city's fortifications. They were the hulls of ships. And here's the genius of his plan. He was going to use Xerxes' own arrogance against him. Meanwhile, at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, King Leonidas of Sparta was making his own impossible choice. The main Greek army wasn't ready. Someone had to buy time. He took 300 Spartans, all of them fathers of living sons, so their bloodlines would continue, and marched north to die. For 2 days, the impossible happened. 300 Spartans, supported by about 7,000 other Greeks, held off the entire Persian army. The narrow pass meant numbers didn't matter, only skill, courage, and the desperate fury of free men fighting for their homes. Xerxes sent his immortals, his elite guard, 10,000 strong, called immortal because whenever one fell, another immediately took his place. They broke against the Spartan shields, like waves against rocks. But here's what the movies never show you: the psychological warfare. After the first day's slaughter, Xerxes sent a herald to the Greeks with an offer: surrender and be granted lands in Asia. Leonidas's response was laconic perfection: come and take them. The king watched from his golden throne as his best troops were slaughtered by these bizarre Greeks who combed their hair before battle and treated death like an invitation to dinner. When told that Persian arrows would be so numerous they'd block out the sun, the Spartan Dienekes smiled and replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." This wasn't bravado. This was a culture that had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of beautiful death. But betrayal came from an unexpected source, and it reveals something crucial about Greek character. A local Greek named Ephialtes, his name became synonymous with nightmare, showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass. Leonidas found himself surrounded. He dismissed the other Greeks and made his final stand with just his 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians who refused to leave. They fought until every last man was dead. Leonidas fell early, and the battle became a desperate struggle for his body. When it was over, Xerxes was so furious he ordered the king's head cut off and mounted on a spike. But Leonidas had won, not the battle, the war. Those 3 days bought Greece the time it needed. More importantly, they proved the Persians could bleed. As Thermopylae fell, the Greek fleet was retreating south. Xerxes had done exactly what Themistocles wanted: burned Athens, destroyed the temples, scattered the population. Now, the Persian king stood in the ruins of the Acropolis, master of Greece, or so he thought. Themistocles had 1 card left to play, and it was the most dangerous gamble in military history. He sent a secret message to Xerxes. The Greek fleet is planning to escape tonight. Attack now before they flee. It was a lie. Themistocles wanted the Persians to attack in the narrow straits of Salamis, where their numbers would be useless. Xerxes took the bait. He had a silver throne placed on Mount Agelaos so he could watch his fleet destroy the Greeks once and for all. September 20th, 480 BC, dawn broke over Salamis. The Persian fleet, 1,200 ships, advanced into the straits. They could see the Greek ships ahead, only 380 vessels, apparently in disarray. This would be a massacre. But as the Persians crowded into the narrow waters, the Greek ships suddenly wheeled around in perfect formation. The trap was sprung. Greek triremes, built for ramming, drove their bronze-sheathed prows into Persian hulls. The sea filled with wreckage, oil, and screaming men. From his throne, Xerxes watched his fleet, the pride of his empire, being systematically destroyed. The goddess Athena herself seemed to be directing the Greek ships, while Persian vessels collided with each other in the chaos. Queen Artemisia of Halicarnassus, fighting for the Persians, rammed and sank one of her own allied ships to escape. When Xerxes saw this, thinking she'd sunk a Greek vessel, he exclaimed, "My men have become women, and my women men." By evening, Persian naval power was broken. Xerxes fled back to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius to finish the conquest. But the spell was broken. The God King had been revealed as mortal. Victory changed everything. The scattered Greek city-states had done the impossible, defeated the greatest empire in the world. But what came next would be even more remarkable. Athens emerged from the Persian Wars transformed. The city that had been burned to ash became the most powerful state in Greece. Under Pericles, a man so influential his era bears his name, Athens built something unprecedented, a maritime empire disguised as a defensive alliance. The Delian League started as protection against Persian revenge. Athens would provide the ships, other cities would provide money or men, but gradually, alliance became empire. Cities that tried to leave were crushed. The treasury moved from neutral Delos to Athens. Allies became subjects. With this wealth flowing in, Pericles launched the most ambitious building program in history: the Parthenon, the Propylaea, the Erechtheion, temples so beautiful they made the gods themselves jealous. Critics complained he was dressing Athens up like a wanton woman. Pericles replied that he was showing the world what free men could accomplish. But Athens's real miracle wasn't in marble and gold. It was in the human mind. In the space of 50 years, this single city produced more genius than most civilizations manage in centuries. Picture the Agora. On any given day in 440 BC, you might see Sophocles discussing his latest tragedy with Euripides, while nearby Socrates was asking uncomfortable questions about justice and virtue. Herodotus might be reading from his histories, while Phidias was planning another masterpiece of sculpture. Take Aeschylus, the father of tragedy. He fought at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, then came home and invented drama as we know it. His plays weren't entertainment. They were examinations of power, justice, and the relationship between gods and mortals. When his Persians premiered, many in the audience had fought in the battles he depicted on stage. Or consider Democritus, who proposed that all matter was made of invisible particles he called atoms, 2,400 years before we proved him right. Meanwhile, Hippocrates was founding medical science by insisting diseases had natural, not supernatural causes. But the giant among giants was Pericles himself, aristocrat by birth, democrat by conviction. He turned Athens into what he called the School of Greece. His funeral oration for the war dead became the greatest speech in defense of democracy ever delivered. We do not copy our neighbors, but are an example to them. But not everyone was impressed by Athenian brilliance. 150 miles south, Sparta watched with growing alarm as Athens grew more powerful and, in their view, more decadent. Sparta was Athens' opposite in every way. Where Athens celebrated individual achievement, Sparta demanded conformity. Where Athens was open to new ideas, Sparta preserved ancient traditions. Where Athens was a democracy, Sparta was ruled by 2 kings and a council of elders. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised by the state. They learned to read and write, but only enough to be functional soldiers. Music and poetry, only war songs. Philosophy, only what was necessary for discipline. The weak were left to die. The strong became the most feared warriors in Greece. Their women were equally extraordinary. Spartan women owned property, exercised publicly, and spoke their minds freely, shocking by Greek standards. When asked why Spartan women were the only ones who could rule men, Queen Gorgo replied, "Because we're the only ones who give birth to men." But Sparta's greatest achievement was its political stability. While other Greek cities suffered civil wars and revolutions, Sparta remained unchanged for centuries. It was their strength and ultimately their weakness. Conflict was inevitable. Athens and Sparta represented 2 incompatible visions of Greek civilization. One valued freedom, creativity, and change. The other prized order, discipline, and tradition. The question wasn't whether they would fight, but when. The spark came from an unlikely source. Corcyra, a colony of Corinth, was fighting its mother city. Athens supported Corcyra. Sparta supported Corinth. By 431 BC, all of Greece was choosing sides. Pericles had a strategy: avoid land battles where Sparta was supreme, use the navy to raid Spartan territory, and wait for the enemy to exhaust themselves. It might have worked, but in 430 BC, plague struck Athens. The disease came from Egypt via the port of Piraeus, the price of being a maritime empire. In 18 months, it killed 1/3 of the population, including Pericles himself. The city that had defied the Persian Empire was brought low by invisible enemies. With Pericles dead, Athens was led by men of lesser vision. Cleon was a demagogue who appealed to the mob. Alcibiades was brilliant but utterly untrustworthy. Nicias was competent but cautious. None had the steady hand Athens needed. The war dragged on for nearly 3 decades. Athens won brilliant victories and suffered catastrophic defeats. The decisive moment came in 415 BC when Athens launched the most ambitious military expedition in its history, the invasion of Sicily. The Sicilian expedition was Athens at its most hubristic. The city-state that had defeated the Persian Empire convinced itself it could conquer the Western Mediterranean. It was a decision that would destroy them. Alcibiades, young, handsome, and absolutely convinced of his own genius, proposed the expedition. Sicily was rich, he argued. Conquest would provide the resources to crush Sparta once and for all. The Athenian assembly was enchanted by visions of glory and gold. In 415 BC, the greatest armada Athens had ever assembled sailed west, 200 ships, 30,000 men, the flower of Athenian youth. It was magnificent and doomed. Just before departure, someone had mutilated the Hermes, sacred statues, throughout Athens. Bad omens multiplied like storm clouds. Then came the greatest betrayal in Greek history. Alcibiades, accused of the sacrilege, was recalled to stand trial. Instead, he fled to Sparta and began advising Athens' enemies. The man who had designed the expedition now worked to destroy it. For 2 years, the Athenian army besieged Syracuse. They came close, so close that victory seemed certain, but Spartan reinforcements arrived, led by the general Gylippus. The besiegers became the besieged. The end came in 413 BC. The Athenian fleet was trapped in Syracuse harbor. Their army, trying to retreat overland, was hunted down like animals. 40,000 men were killed or enslaved. The prisoners were thrown into stone quarries, where most died of exposure and starvation. Those few who survived owed their lives to an unexpected source, their education. Some Syracusans spared Athenians who could recite verses from Euripides. Poetry, it turned out, was more valuable than gold. The Sicilian disaster broke Athens' power, but not immediately. Like a wounded lion, the city fought on for another decade, but the writing was on the wall, written in Spartan gold. Persia, seeking revenge for Marathon and Salamis, began funding Sparta's navy. The Athenian Empire crumbled as subject cities rebelled. At Aegospotami in 405 BC, the Spartan admiral Lysander destroyed the last Athenian fleet. Sparta's terms were harsh, but not genocidal. Athens' walls were torn down, its fleet reduced to 12 ships, its empire dissolved, but the city itself survived. As Lysander's men demolished the long walls connecting Athens to its port, flute girls played and Spartans danced. They believed they were celebrating the liberation of Greece. They were wrong. What they had destroyed was not tyranny, but the greatest experiment in human freedom the world had ever seen. Democracy was dead, or so it seemed. In 404 BC, Sparta installed the 30 tyrants to rule Athens. These aristocrats, bitter over their city's democratic experiment, began a reign of terror. 1,500 Athenians were executed without trial. Thousands more fled into exile. But democracy had planted deeper roots than anyone realized. In 403 BC, the democratic exiles returned and overthrew the tyrants. The restored democracy was different, more cautious, less ambitious, but it was still democracy. The idea had survived its first death. In this atmosphere of defeat and recrimination, Athens turned on one of its greatest sons. Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, the man who spent his life asking uncomfortable questions, was put on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety. The charges were absurd, but the real crime was guilt by association. Socrates had taught Alcibiades, the traitor. He had influenced Critias, leader of the 30 tyrants. In a city looking for scapegoats, the philosopher made a perfect target. At his trial, Socrates could have groveled, apologized, gone into exile. Instead, he defended philosophy itself. The unexamined life is not worth living, he told the 501 jurors. Rather than ask for mercy, he suggested the city should honor him with free meals for life. The jury voted for death by a wider margin than they had voted for guilt. Socrates had turned a possible acquittal into certain execution through sheer intellectual arrogance or integrity. His student Plato was in the courtroom that day, watching his teacher condemned to death by the democracy he had died to preserve. It was a moment that would echo through philosophy forever. Socrates spent his last month in prison discussing philosophy with friends. He could have escaped. His followers had bribed the guards, but he refused. "I have lived as a citizen of Athens," he said. "I will die as one." On the appointed day, he drank the hemlock calmly, continuing to discuss the immortality of the soul even as the poison worked its way up his legs. His last words were typically unexpected. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt." Even in death, he was reminding his friends of their obligations. Socrates' execution was Athens' greatest mistake. His death transformed him from a local curiosity into a martyr for truth. More importantly, it radicalized his student Plato. Plato concluded that democracy was mob rule, that the masses could never be trusted with power. In his Republic, he designed an alternative, a state ruled by philosopher kings who would govern through reason rather than passion. In 387 BC, Plato founded the Academy outside Athens, the world's first university. For nearly 900 years, it would train the greatest minds of the ancient world. Students came from across the Mediterranean to study mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. But Plato's greatest student would surpass even him. Aristotle arrived at the academy as a teenager and stayed for 20 years. When Plato died, Aristotle left to tutor a young Macedonian prince named Alexander. Aristotle's mind was different from his teachers. Where Plato looked for eternal truths, Aristotle studied the world as it was. He classified animals, studied politics, founded logic as a formal discipline. His Lyceum became the rival of Plato's Academy. Together, teacher and student created the intellectual framework of Western civilization. Every university, every scientific method, every political theory traces its roots back to these two men walking and talking in ancient Athens. But while philosophers debated in Athens, a new power was rising in the north. Macedonia had been a backwater kingdom, barely considered Greek by the sophisticated southerners. That was about to change dramatically. Philip II of Macedon was everything the Greeks claimed to despise, a barbarian king from the northern frontier, but he was also exactly what Greece needed, a man capable of uniting the quarreling city-states, whether they wanted it or not. Philip's transformation began in Thebes. As a teenage hostage, he studied under Epaminondas, the general who had broken Spartan power at Leuctra. Philip learned Greek military tactics, but more importantly, he learned Greek weaknesses. Returning to Macedonia in 359 BC, Philip found a kingdom under siege. Illyrians pressed from the west, Paeonians from the north, Greek cities encroached from the south. Lesser men would have despaired. Philip saw opportunity. His first innovation was military. The Macedonian phalanx used sarissas, pikes 18 feet long that outranged any Greek spear. But Philip's real genius was combining different military units: heavy infantry, cavalry, archers, siege engines. While Greeks still fought like their ancestors at Troy, Philip invented combined arms warfare. His second innovation was political. Instead of conquering and garrisoning cities, Philip preferred corruption. Why fight Athens when you could buy Athenian politicians? His gold, as he boasted, could capture any fortress if the gate was wide enough for a donkey carrying coins. By 340 BC, Philip controlled most of northern Greece. The southern cities finally realized their danger, but it was almost too late. Demosthenes, Athens' greatest orator, delivered speech after speech warning of the Macedonian threat. His Philippics became synonymous with passionate denunciation. In 338 BC, the decisive moment arrived. Athens and Thebes, ancient enemies, united against Macedonia. Their army met Philip's at Chaeronea, a small town in central Greece that would witness the end of the classical age. The Greeks outnumbered the Macedonians, and their position was strong. For once, they had overcome their fatal tendency to squabble at crucial moments. This would be freedom's last stand. Philip commanded the right wing personally, while his 18-year-old son, Alexander, led the cavalry on the left. The boy prince was about to announce himself to history. The battle began with the Greeks attacking the Macedonian right. Philip's men gave ground. Apparently retreating in disorder, the Greeks pressed forward, breaking formation in their eagerness to crush the barbarians. It was a trap. At the crucial moment, Philip's phalanx stopped retreating and counterattacked with their long sarissas. The Greek center, stretched and disordered, began to crumble. On the left, young Alexander saw his moment. Leading the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge, he smashed into the Theban sacred band. 300 elite warriors who had never known defeat. When the dust settled, all 300 lay dead. In 336 BC, Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, murdered by his own bodyguard in a conspiracy that remains mysterious to this day. The throne passed to Alexander, just 20 years old and facing rebellions across the Greek world. The southern cities led by Thebes saw opportunity in the young king's inexperience. They were catastrophically wrong. Alexander's response was swift and merciless. He marched south, captured Thebes after a brief siege, and made a decision that shocked the Greek world. He razed the city completely. 30,000 Thebans were sold into slavery. The city that had produced Pindar and Epaminondas was wiped from the map. The message was clear. This was not Philip's patient diplomacy. This was something harder and more dangerous. The other Greek cities submitted immediately. But Alexander's real target was never Greece. It was the Persian Empire. Since Marathon, Greeks had dreamed of revenge against the barbarians who had burned Athens. Alexander would make that dream reality, but on a scale beyond any Greek imagination. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 35,000 men, barely a fifth the size of Xerxes' invasion force. But what he lacked in numbers, he made up for in quality and leadership. His first stop was Troy, where he sacrificed to Achilles and declared himself the heir of Homer's heroes. This wasn't just theater. Alexander genuinely saw himself as the new Achilles, destined to win glory through conquest. At the river Granicus, Alexander faced his first Persian army. His generals urged caution. The river was deep, the banks steep, the enemy prepared. Alexander's response was characteristic. He spurred his horse into the water and charged. The Battle of Granicus was a cavalry melee of unprecedented savagery. Alexander fought in the front rank, his white-plumed helmet making him a target for every Persian noble seeking glory. A Persian noble's axe split his helmet. Another scimitar nearly took his head. Only the quick action of his bodyguard Cletus saved the king's life. Victory opened Asia Minor to the Greeks. City after city surrendered or was stormed. But at Halicarnassus, Alexander faced his first serious resistance. The city was defended by Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary in Persian service, and one of the few generals who understood how to fight Alexander. The siege lasted months. Alexander's engineers built towers, dug tunnels, deployed catapults. The defenders countered every move. Finally, the Macedonians breached the walls, but the fighting continued street by street, house by house. When Halicarnassus finally fell, Alexander made a crucial decision. Instead of the usual massacre, he spared the population and appointed a local ruler. This would become his pattern: conquer with the sword, rule with mercy. But these were just preliminaries. Deeper in Asia, Darius III, the great king of Persia, was assembling an army that would dwarf anything Alexander had yet faced. The real test was coming. By 333 BC, Alexander controlled the entire coast of Asia Minor, but he had yet to face the Persian Empire's full might. That changed when Darius III himself took the field. Darius was not the warrior his ancestors had been, but he was no coward, leading an army of 100,000 men, including the famous immortals. He moved to crush this upstart Macedonian prince once and for all. The armies met at Issus, where the narrow coastal plain negated Darius's numerical advantage. Alexander, now 23, was about to face the richest and most powerful ruler on earth. The battle began with Alexander doing the impossible. Again, leading his companions in a wedge formation, he charged directly at Darius's position in the center. It was the ultimate gamble: kill or capture the great king, or die trying. The moment of contact was apocalyptic. Macedonian lances met Persian shields in a crash that could be heard across the battlefield. Alexander, conspicuous in his polished armor, cut his way through the Persian guards like a force of nature. Darius, seeing this demon in human form bearing down on him, made the most fateful decision in Persian history. He fled. The sight of their god king's golden chariot racing away broke the Persian army's will. Alexander captured Darius's family, his mother, wife, and daughters. But instead of the customary rape and murder, he treated them with royal honors. When Darius's mother mistakenly prostrated herself before Hephaestion, Alexander's taller companion, thinking he was the king, Alexander gently corrected her. "You are not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander." This mercy was calculated. Alexander wasn't just conquering the Persian Empire, he was inheriting it. Every act of clemency won him Persian allies. Every atrocity would have created lifelong enemies. Victory at Issus opened the path to Egypt and Babylon, but Alexander made an unexpected choice. Instead of pursuing Darius, he turned south toward a small island city that dared defy him: Tyre. Tyre was supposedly impregnable, a fortress on an island half a mile from shore, protected by walls 150 feet high. No army had ever taken it by storm. The Tyrians were confident in their defenses and their powerful navy. Alexander's solution was typically audacious. If he couldn't reach the island, he would bring the island to him. He ordered the construction of a causeway, a stone bridge nearly half a mile long built straight across the water. For months, his soldiers hauled rocks, timber, and earth into the sea. The Tyrians attacked constantly. Fire ships, divers to sabotage the work, catapults raining stones from the walls. Alexander himself worked alongside his men, dodging arrows and lifting stones. The causeway grew longer, but so did Tyrian resistance. They built their walls higher, sent ships to attack the construction crews, even hired divers to swim out at night and tear down the day's work. Alexander's response was to turn the siege into history's greatest engineering project. He built towers taller than Tyre's walls, mounted siege engines on ships, even recruited a navy from other Phoenician cities tired of Tyrian arrogance. After 7 months, the walls were breached. The final assault was merciless. 8,000 Tyrians died in the fighting. 30,000 were sold into slavery. Alexander crucified 2,000 survivors along the coast as a warning to other cities. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was futile, but it was also proof of Alexander's character: magnificent in victory, ruthless toward those who defied him, and absolutely unwilling to accept that anything was impossible. From Tyre, Alexander marched to Egypt, and here, everything changed. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian rule for 2 centuries, welcomed him as a liberator. More than that, they declared him a god. At Memphis, the ancient capital, Alexander was crowned pharaoh, according to rituals older than Greek civilization. But the moment that would define his legend came at the Oracle of Ammon in the Libyan desert. The journey to Siwa Oasis was perilous, 300 miles across trackless desert where entire armies had disappeared. Alexander's guides lost their way, water ran low, sandstorms threatened to bury the expedition. But at the crucial moment, according to his historians, divine intervention saved them. Ravens appeared to guide the way. Rain fell from cloudless skies. Alexander began to believe his own propaganda, that he was truly the son of Zeus. At the oracle, the priest greeted him Azan of Ammon, Zeus's Egyptian equivalent. What passed between them remained secret, but Alexander emerged transformed. He was no longer just a Macedonian king conquering foreign lands. He was a divine ruler destined to unite the world. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander founded the city that would bear his name, Alexandria. Designed by the architect Dinocrates, it would become the greatest city of the ancient world, home to the famous lighthouse and library. But Alexandria was more than a city. It was a symbol. Here, Greek learning would merge with Egyptian wisdom, Macedonian energy with Persian luxury. It was the first truly cosmopolitan city, where a man's merit mattered more than his birthplace. While Alexander played God in Egypt, Darius was preparing for the battle that would decide the fate of the world. At Gaugamela, in modern Iraq, he assembled the largest army in history, perhaps 250,000 men, drawn from every corner of his vast empire. This time, Darius chose the battlefield carefully. The plain was perfect for his chariots and cavalry, with no rivers or hills to limit his movements. He even had the ground leveled to give his war chariots the best possible charge. Alexander arrived with just 47,000 men, outnumbered 5-1. His officers urged him to attack at night, but Alexander refused. "I will not steal victory like a thief." He would win in daylight for all the world to see. October 1st, 331 BC. Dawn revealed the greatest military spectacle in ancient history. Darius's center was a wall of immortals and Greek mercenaries. His flanks bristled with cavalry from Bactria, Scythia, and India. War, elephants, and scythe chariots completed the terrifying array. Alexander's battle plan was his masterpiece. He would refuse his left flank, attack obliquely with his right, and personally lead the decisive charge at the exact moment when Darius's line was most vulnerable. The battle began with Darius's scythed chariots, war machines designed to break infantry formations through sheer terror. But Alexander's men had practiced for this. They opened ranks, let the chariots through, then surrounded and destroyed them. As the cavalry battle raged on the flanks, Alexander saw his moment. A gap opened in the Persian center as units moved to support the flanks. Leading his companions in a wedge formation, Alexander charged straight for Darius. For the second time, the kings of Macedon and Persia faced each other in personal combat. But this time, there would be no escape. Alexander's spear took down Darius's charioteer. Persian nobles fell like wheat before his cavalry. Darius, seeing Alexander cutting his way through the royal guard like an avatar of war itself, broke and fled. The Persian Empire, which had ruled from India to Egypt for 2 centuries, died at that moment. Alexander pursued briefly, then returned to the battlefield. He had won more than a victory. He had won the world. At 25, he was master of the largest empire in history. But victory brought unexpected challenges. How do you rule 100 different peoples? How do you hold together an empire stretching from Greece to India? Alexander's answer would be as revolutionary as his conquests. Alexander's conquests created a problem no Greek had ever faced. How do you govern half the known world? His solution was radical. He would become Persian as much as Macedonian, Eastern as much as Western. At Babylon, the ancient capital of Mesopotamia, Alexander did something that shocked his followers. He adopted Persian court dress, Persian customs, even the Persian practice of proskynesis, requiring subjects to prostrate themselves before the king. His Macedonian veterans were horrified. They had followed him to conquer barbarians, not to become them. When Alexander demanded that even Greeks prostrate themselves, his own historian Callisthenes refused, declaring, "I will not make a god of a mortal man." Alexander's response was swift and brutal. Callisthenes was arrested, tortured, and died in custody. The message was clear. The old Alexander, the Macedonian warrior king, was dead. In his place stood a divine monarch ruling by divine right. But Alexander's transformation wasn't just about ceremony. He began appointing Persians to high positions, marrying Persian noblewomen to his generals, even recruiting Persian soldiers into his elite units. This was fusion, not conquest, the creation of a new hybrid civilization. By 327 BC, Alexander's policies were creating dangerous tensions within his own ranks. The breaking point came from an unexpected source: his own pages, the noble Macedonian youths who served as his bodyguards. The immediate cause was trivial. A page named Hermolaus had killed a boar during a royal hunt before Alexander could strike. As punishment, he was publicly flogged, a humiliation no Macedonian noble could endure. Hermolaus and his fellow pages plotted to murder Alexander in his sleep, but the conspiracy was discovered before it could be executed. Under torture, the pages confessed and implicated Callisthenes as their intellectual inspiration. The executions that followed were brutal, even by Macedonian standards. The pages were stoned to death by their fellow soldiers, a traditional punishment that made every man complicit in their deaths. But the real victim was trust. Alexander now saw conspiracies everywhere. His Macedonian veterans felt increasingly alienated by his Persian policies. The army that had conquered the world was beginning to turn against its leader. The breaking point came at a banquet in Samarkand in 328 BC. Alexander and his officers were drinking heavily, a dangerous combination with the king's increasingly volatile temper. Clitus the Black, Alexander's cavalry commander, and the man who had saved his life at Granicus, had been watching his king's transformation with growing disgust. When the conversation turned to Alexander's divine pretensions, Clitus had heard enough. "Your victories are not yours alone," Clitus shouted, wine and years of frustration making him reckless. "They belong to all Macedonians. You forget that you are Philip's son, not Zeus's." The hall fell silent. No one had ever dared speak to Alexander this way. The king's face went white with rage. "You call me bastard?" he snarled, reaching for a weapon. Friends held him back, but Clitus wasn't finished. "I saved your life at Granicus," he continued. "And this is how you repay me? By making us bow like slaves to Persian customs?" Alexander broke free from his restrainers, grabbed a sarissa from a guard, and drove it through Clitus's chest. His oldest friend, his savior, the brother of his beloved nurse, dead by his own hand in a moment of blind fury. The aftermath was devastating. Alexander locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing food or visitors, calling out Clitus's name in anguish. When he finally emerged, something had broken inside him. The guilt would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Despite these internal struggles, Alexander pushed ever eastward. After conquering Persia, he moved into India, driven by an insatiable desire to reach the edge of the world, literally the ocean that Greeks believed surrounded all land. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, he faced King Porus and his war elephants, creatures that terrified horses and men alike. It was perhaps Alexander's most brilliant tactical victory, using mobility and coordination to defeat an enemy that seemed unstoppable. But victory came at a cost. Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, his companion since childhood, died from wounds received in the battle. The king founded a city in his honor, one of many Alexandrias that would spread Greek culture across Asia. As Alexander prepared to march further east toward the Ganges and the kingdoms beyond, his army finally said no. At the Hyphasis River, his veterans, men who had followed him for 8 years across 11,000 miles, refused to go further. Conus, one of his most trusted generals, spoke for the army. "Sire, we have conquered enough. We want to see our homes again, our wives and children. We want to enjoy the fruits of our victories before we die in some distant land." Alexander raged, pleaded, threatened. For 3 days he sulked in his tent, hoping his men would relent. But for once in his life, his will was not enough. The conqueror of the world had finally met an unconquerable enemy, homesickness. Reluctantly, Alexander agreed to turn back. But even in retreat, he couldn't resist one final adventure. Instead of retracing his route through the mountains, he decided to sail down the Indus River to the Indian Ocean, then march his army across the Gedrosian Desert. The desert march was a catastrophe. Heat, thirst, and sandstorms killed thousands. Of the 85,000 men who entered the desert, perhaps 15,000 emerged alive. It was Alexander's greatest military disaster, born from his refusal to accept any limitation on his will. But even this disaster couldn't dim his vision. Returning to Babylon in 324 BC, he began planning new conquests: Arabia, the Western Mediterranean, perhaps even the Atlantic Ocean beyond. At 32, he still believed the whole world was his for the taking. In June 323 BC, Alexander was in Babylon planning his next campaign when he fell ill after a banquet. It began with fever and chills, nothing unusual for a man who had survived countless battles and wounds. But this was different. Day by day, the fever worsened. Alexander's powerful constitution, which had carried him through poison, wounds, and desert crossings, finally began to fail. As news of the king's illness spread, his veterans gathered outside the palace. These grizzled soldiers who had followed him across the known world demanded to see their leader one last time. Too weak to speak, Alexander could only nod to each man as they filed past his bed. When asked who should inherit his empire, Alexander supposedly whispered, "To the strongest." Some claim he said, "To Craterus," his most trusted general. Others insist his final words were unintelligible. The truth was lost in the political chaos that followed. On June 10th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He was 32 years old. In 13 years of campaigning, he had never lost a battle. He had created the largest empire in ancient history, and he had changed the world forever. But Alexander's greatest achievement wasn't military. It was cultural. He had taken Greek civilization and spread it from Spain to India, creating a cosmopolitan world where ideas, art, and knowledge could flow freely across continents. Alexander's death triggered the Wars of the Successors, 40 years of conflict as his generals carved up his empire. But even as they fought, they spread Greek culture deeper into Asia and Africa than ever before. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded a dynasty that would last 300 years. Seleucus claimed the Asian provinces, creating an empire stretching from Turkey to Afghanistan. Antigonus held Macedonia and fought everyone else until his death at Ipsus in 301 BC. These Hellenistic kingdoms were different from classical Greece. They were cosmopolitan, wealthy, and ruled by god-kings rather than citizen assemblies. Greek became the lingua franca from Sicily to the Indus River. Alexandria in Egypt emerged as the greatest city of this new world. Its library contained 700,000 scrolls, the sum total of human knowledge. Its lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders. Its scholars included Euclid, who systematized geometry, and Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference. But the real revolution was cultural fusion. In Bactria, modern Afghanistan, Greek kings ruled Buddhist subjects and created art that blended Hellenic and Indian traditions. In Egypt, Ptolemaic pharaohs worshipped both Zeus and Ammon. In Syria, Greek philosophy merged with Eastern mysticism. While the Hellenistic kingdoms flourished, a new power was rising in the West. Rome had begun as a small Italian city-state, but by 264 BC, it controlled the entire peninsula and was looking beyond. The Romans were different from the Greeks. Where Greeks valued individual brilliance, Romans prized collective discipline. Where Greeks created art and philosophy, Romans built roads and aqueducts. Where Greeks founded colonies, Romans created provinces. The collision was inevitable. It began in Sicily, where Roman and Carthaginian interests clashed. But by 200 BC, Rome was looking east toward the wealthy Hellenistic kingdoms. The Romans justified their aggression as liberation, freeing the Greeks from Macedonian tyranny. Some Greeks believed them. Others, like the historian Polybius, saw through the propaganda to the naked imperialism beneath. Kingdom by kingdom, the Romans advanced. Macedonia fell in 168 BC at the Battle of Pydna. The Seleucid Empire crumbled under internal strife and Roman pressure. Even mighty Egypt became a Roman client state. In 146 BC, Rome made its intentions brutally clear when Corinth led a rebellion against Roman domination. The consul Mummius sacked the city completely. The same year, Carthage, Rome's great rival, was also destroyed. The message was unmistakable: resistance was futile. But Greek civilization was not so easily conquered. Even as Roman legions occupied Greek cities, Greek culture conquered Roman minds. As the poet Horace wrote, "Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror." Roman nobles sent their sons to Athens to study philosophy. Roman poets imitated Greek models. Roman artists copied Greek sculptures. The conquerors became disciples of the conquered. In 88 BC, Mithridates VI of Pontus launched the last great war against Roman rule. He positioned himself as the liberator of Greek culture from Roman barbarism. For a moment, it seemed possible that the East might throw off Western domination. But Rome's resources were too vast, its military machine too efficient. Mithridates was defeated by Pompey, and the last independent Greek kingdom fell to Roman rule. Yet, in a deeper sense, Greece had won. The Romans might rule the Mediterranean, but they ruled it as heirs of Greek civilization. Roman law was influenced by Greek philosophy. Roman architecture borrowed Greek forms. Roman religion absorbed Greek mythology. When Augustus became the first Roman emperor in 27 BC, he styled himself as the heir of Alexander. The Pax Romana that followed was built on Hellenistic foundations, a cosmopolitan world where Greek remained the language of culture and learning. In the Eastern Mediterranean, where Greek culture remained strongest, a new movement was emerging that would transform the world yet again. Christianity began as a Jewish sect, but it spread through the Greek-speaking communities of the Roman Empire. The Apostle Paul, writing in Greek to Greek-speaking congregations, used concepts from Greek philosophy to explain Christian theology. The New Testament itself was written in Greek, ensuring that Christian thought would be shaped by Hellenic ideas. When Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, he founded his new capital at Constantinople, ancient Byzantium. This new Rome was thoroughly Greek in culture, even as it claimed Roman political authority. The Church Fathers, Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, were all Greek-educated intellectuals who used Platonic philosophy to to defend Christian doctrine. They created a synthesis of Greek reason and Christian faith that would dominate Western thought for a millennium. Even as the Western Roman Empire collapsed under barbarian invasions, the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, preserved Greek learning and culture. For another 1,000 years, Constantinople remained the greatest city in the Christian world. When Arab armies conquered the Eastern Mediterranean in the 7th century, they encountered a world still steeped in Greek learning. Rather than destroying this heritage, Islamic scholars embraced it. In Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, Muslim intellectuals translated Greek texts into Arabic. Aristotle's works, lost to the Latin West, survived in Arabic translation. Ptolemy's geography, Galen's medicine, Euclid's mathematics, all were preserved by Islamic civilization. Scholars like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Averroes didn't just preserve Greek learning, they extended it. They combined Aristotelian logic with Islamic theology, Greek mathematics with Indian numerals, Ptolemaic astronomy with careful observation. When Crusaders encountered this sophisticated Islamic civilization, they were amazed by its learning and luxury. Many Crusader states adopted Islamic administrative practices and architectural styles. The encounter between Christianity and Islam was also an encounter between different interpretations of the Greek heritage. In 1453, Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks. As the last remnant of the Byzantine Empire collapsed, Greek scholars fled westward, carrying with them manuscripts that had been lost to the West for centuries. These refugee scholars arrived in Italy just as the Renaissance was beginning. Suddenly, Latin scholars could read Plato in the original Greek, study Homer without Latin intermediaries, encounter the full range of ancient Greek literature. The impact was revolutionary. Humanists like Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino founded new schools of philosophy based on Greek texts. Artists like Raphael and Michelangelo drew inspiration from Greek sculpture and architecture. The printing press, invented around 1450, ensured that these Greek texts would never again be lost. Aldus Manutius in Venice published beautiful editions of Greek classics that spread across Europe. Greek became part of every educated person's curriculum. But the Renaissance did more than preserve Greek culture. It transformed it. Renaissance thinkers combined Greek rationalism with Christian humanism to create new ways of understanding the world. The scientific revolution that followed drew heavily on Greek mathematical and logical methods. By the 18th century, ancient Greece had become the foundation myth of Western civilization. The American founding fathers studied Greek political theory when designing their new republic. The French revolutionaries looked to Athens for models of democratic government. The Romantic movement of the 19th century made Greece synonymous with beauty, freedom, and artistic inspiration. Lord Byron died fighting for Greek independence, declaring, "The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea." Greek revival architecture appeared across Europe and America. The British Museum, the U.S. Capitol, countless banks and universities adopted Greek columns and pediments. The visual language of power became unmistakably Greek. When Greece finally achieved independence in 1832, it was hailed across Europe as the resurrection of classical civilization. The reality was more complex. Modern Greeks were Orthodox Christians whose language had evolved far from ancient Attic, but the symbolism was irresistible. The 20th century brought new ways of understanding Greek civilization. Archaeologists like Heinrich Schliemann uncovered Troy and Mycenae, proving that Homer's epics contained historical truth. Arthur Evans revealed the sophisticated Minoan civilization that had preceded classical Greece. Today, 2,500 years after the Battle of Marathon, we still grapple with questions first posed by ancient Greeks. What is justice? How should we govern ourselves? What is the good life? What do we owe our fellow citizens? Greek democracy was flawed. It excluded women, slaves, and foreigners. But the idea that ordinary people should have a voice in government remains revolutionary in much of the world. Every time someone votes, they participate in an experiment that began in ancient Athens. Greek philosophy continues to shape how we think. When scientists use logic to test hypotheses, they follow methods developed by Aristotle. When artists strive for ideal beauty, they chase standards set by Phidias and Praxiteles. When politicians debate ethics, they use categories defined by Plato. Even our entertainment bears Greek DNA. Every movie with a hero's journey echoes the Odyssey. Every tragedy that shows the fall of the mighty follows patterns established by Aeschylus and Sophocles. Every comedy that celebrates the triumph of the underdog owes something to Aristophanes. The Greek city-states themselves vanished long ago. The last native speaker of ancient Greek died centuries past. The temples are ruins, the libraries are dust, the citizens are gone. But the ideas survive. Democracy and philosophy, science and art, history and drama. These are Greece's true monuments, more enduring than marble, more precious than gold. In every laboratory where someone seeks truth through reason, in every courtroom where justice is pursued through argument, in every school where young minds encounter Socrates' questions, there, ancient Greece lives on. The Greeks asked the most important question of all: what does it mean to be human? They didn't find the final answer. Perhaps there isn't one. But in their searching, in their striving, in their magnificent failures and glorious achievements, they showed us something essential about the human spirit. They showed us that we are more than mere animals driven by instinct. We can think, create, question, dream. We can build civilizations and tear them down. We can reach for the gods while remaining eternally, gloriously human. This is the story of ancient Greece, not just what they accomplished, but what they made possible. Not just how they lived, but how they taught us to live. Not just their history, but the history they made inevitable. And that story isn't over. Every time someone stands up for democracy, pursues knowledge, creates beauty, or asks uncomfortable questions, they continue the Greek legacy. The conversation that began in the Agora of Athens still echoes in classrooms and parliaments, laboratories and theaters around the world. We are all Greeks now, heirs to their questions, beneficiaries of their courage, students in the school they founded. And as long as human beings seek truth, beauty, and justice, ancient Greece will never truly die.